Last time we spoke about the reluctant Lord Elgin, who took up a job as the new emissary to China. Alongside his French counterpart, Baron Gros, both men would overlook their military coalition's expedition in China to force the Qing emperor to abide by their treaty and some new demands. They began with a bombardment and occupation of the grand city of Canton, and then Ye Mingchen was hunted down and arrested. Ye was replaced with a puppet named Pi Kui, who would be nominally controlled by the European forces. Now the coalition would fight their way to Beijing to force an audience with Emperor Xianfang, but something lied in their way, the famous Taku Forts at the mouth of the Beihou River. Could the coalition fight past these legendary forts and strangle Beijing enough to get their demands met? This episode is part 3 of the Second Opium War, Battles for the Taku Forts. Welcome back to the Fall and Rise of China podcast. I'm your dutiful host, Craig Watson. But before we can begin, I just want to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about the history of Asia? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on the history of Asia and much, much more, so go give them a look over on YouTube. So please, subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast, the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that you are still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel over at YouTube. Perhaps you're looking for more of a visual experience? I have a 45-minute episode on the Second Opium War. Give it a look, and it'll mean a lot to me. At high tide, the Taku Forts were surrounded by water. The Beihou River became something like a natural moat. The entrance to the Beihou River was 200 yards in width, forcing the British and French warships into a bottleneck gauntlet, which each shore holding 137 pieces of antiquated artillery. When the invaders arrived, the Qing forces quickly went to work creating earthwork walls with sandbags to bolster the defenses. Now, the Qing forces presumed the European gunboats' hulls were too deep, and thus they would not risk entering the river until it was very high tide, to avoid going aground. That presumption was a grave error, as Seymour and Rigaud were willing to risk it and mounted a surprise attack at 10 a.m. on May the 20th. Elgin made one last-ditch effort to try and get Tan to surrender peacefully, but Tan did not even bother to respond to Elgin's message. Now, in a similar fashion to the First Opium War, as you might have remembered, a large problem for the Qing was their outdated artillery. Their cannons were usually immobile, unable to aim at all degrees and angles. The Taku Forts cannons were aimed in such a way to hit warships specifically at high tide, but the British-French force was going to attack during a lower tide. Alongside the Taku Forts cannons, another defensive obstacle was a 7-inch thick boom made out of bamboo. The Europeans opened fire, unleashing pure hell upon the forts, and when the forts unleashed their own volley, literally all of their shots went over the European masts. To add insult to injury, the British sacrificed one of their own ships, the Coromandel, to ram into the boom, which broke with ease. The Coromandel received a nasty gash in her hull, but the job had been done. As pieces of the boom floated away, the rest of the European armada began to steam through the gap while the Qing helplessly fired their cannons straight over their masts. The French ships Mitraille and Fusil, alongside the British Cormorant, fired upon the two Taku forts on the left bank, while the French Avalanche, Dragon, and British Nimrod fired upon the three forts on the right. The Chinese men in Gingals had much better luck than their cannons, though it also came at the price of making Europeans laugh their ass off watching men fall over upon firing each shot. However, not all was funny, as Gingals could be properly aimed, unlike the cannons, and they did manage to kill 5 British and 6 French, while wounding another 61 men. Then, tragedy happened, when a gunpowder cache in one of the Taku forts accidentally exploded, killing over 100 Chinese defenders. Alongside the invaders' maelstrom of gunfire and the defenders' despair at the futility of their own cannons, many began to panic. Even before many of the British and French forces began to land ashore, Countless Qing forces were deserting the earthen parapet en masse. In desperation, seeing his men flee, the Qing commander launched 50 fireboats stuffed with straw at the barbarian ships, only to see the fireships crash into the bank at the bend in the river. Not a single fireship was able to cause damage to the invaders. With the last-ditch effort a complete failure, the commander of the Taku Forts went to the temple of the sea god and slashed his jugular vein with his own sword, killing himself. The viceroy of Juli province was banished to the desolate border territory with Russia in the north. As he packed his bags, Emperor Xianfeng condemned the viceroy's mismanagement of the Taku Fort's defense as being, quote, without plan or resource. Lord Elgin, after witnessing the victory over the Taku Forts, had really an interesting thing to say. 24 determined men with revolvers and a sufficient number of cartridges might walk through China from one end to another. Back home in jolly old England, Elgin was being praised and rewarded likewise with carte blanche for all further military actions and negotiations. The new Prime Minister, Lord Derby, whom I guess won his position from all those grand speeches that he had made, they really worked out for him. Well, he sent Elgin a congratulatory dispatch, to which Elgin would say, giving my latitude to do anything I choose, if only I will finish the affair. So the very same man who condemned British imperialism the year prior was now a war hawk. Oh, how politics changes a man. Lord Malmesbury became the new foreign minister, replacing Lord Clarendon. Back in China, the European gunboats made their way up the Beihe River triumphantly towards the Qing stronghold of Tientsin. Now, Tientsin was around 30 miles away from Beijing. The three plenipotentiaries stayed further behind at the Taku Forts for their own safety as Seymour and Legault took the lead. As they steamed up the Beihe River, both the Fusée and Cormorant ran aground numerous times, but the Europeans found some very unlikely allies to help them: the local Chinese. Yes, it turns out a lot of the populace absolutely hated their Manchu overlords, and they volunteered their tugboats free of charge to help the Europeans. Apparently, when the Europeans tried to pay them, many refused it. On June the 4th, the European armada arrived at Tientsin without any resistance along the way. The Qing defenders at Tientsin's morale was so low, they were at the point of surrender. There was also a rumor spreading around that Emperor Xianfeng had been overthrown and replaced by a new dynasty, who was willing to simply sign a new treaty with the Europeans. Seymour and Legault advised Elgin he should stay at the Taku Forts for security, but he disregarded this and came up to the war party by May the 26th. Elgin wrote in his diary as he made his way up the river, "Through the night watches, when no Chinaman moves, when the junks cast anchor, we labored on, cutting ruthlessly and recklessly through the glancing and startling river, which, until the last few weeks, no stranger keel had ever furrowed. Whose work are we engaged in, when we burst thus with hideous violence and brutal energy into these darkest and most mysterious recesses of the traditions of the past? I wish I could answer that question in a manner satisfactory to myself. At the same time, there is certainly not much to regret in the old civilization, which we are thus scattering to the winds. A dense population, timorous and pauperized, such would seem to be its chief product." The plenipotentiaries were quite surprised when they were met outside Tientsin by a detachment of local Qing officials and merchants who came looking for opium. Yes, these were those types of middlemen folk who were used to bribes and the lucrative business of smuggling opium. Now, despite the rumors, Emperor Xianfeng had not been overthrown, but he was willing to negotiate with the Europeans. Emperor Xianfeng sent commissionaries to Tientsin in the hope of stopping the European advance to Beijing. Meanwhile, with Tientsin not putting up a fight, Elgin wrote in his diary, "I have complete military command of the capital of China, without having broken off relations with the neutral powers, and without having interrupted for a single day our trade at the different ports of the empire. I actually would like to take just a small moment here to make a note of something. It is interesting that Elgin notes that trade had not been interrupted at all for even a single day. You would find this rather surprising, given the fact that two major events are occurring. Of course, the Europeans are having their Second Opium War with the Qing dynasty, but also the Qing dynasty is undergoing probably the worst civil war in Chinese history, that of course being the Taiping Rebellion. So you'd probably be asking yourself, with half of China literally on fire and in the hands of rebels, having a war with the Qing dynasty, and then the Europeans are basically invading along the coast, how in the hell is trade still going on, and if so, how's it going on very well? Well, as I am recording this very podcast, I am also reading, I think, my 5th book on the Taiping Rebellion, and the author of this book actually had an answer to this very question, and I found it pretty interesting. At the highest point of the Taiping Rebellion, when the Taiping controlled a lot of provinces, all of the trade networks inside China began to crumble. All of the silk dealers and the tea dealers couldn't trade internally anymore. The only means of acquiring any money was to trade externally. So, all those on the eastern coast, whether under Taiping control or Qing control, were trading with the Europeans. Both the Qing and the Taiping did pretty much nothing to stop the trade with the Europeans. Because don't forget, they are fighting a civil war and they're both vying for European arms. It's rather funny to think the Qing are literally fighting a war against the British and the French, while on the side, many of their provincial governors are trading with those said Europeans for arms to try and fight the Taiping. And as my author pointed out, trade did not simply resume, it flourished. For example, British textile work, all the cotton goods that they sold, they were selling it en masse to China. It would actually be only in 1861, with the outbreak of the American Civil War, that the British would have to increase the price for the textile goods because of the lack of cotton from, the United States South. And because of the prices going up, the Chinese could simply not afford them anymore, and thus the textile industry kind of collapsed. Anyways, that was just some tidbit information I had picked up last week, so I thought I'd just throw it out there. Back to the story. The Europeans were treated with the utmost respect, and the lavish temple known as the Supreme Felicity was used as headquarters for the Europeans. The Europeans transformed the temple by creating a bowling alley, and they used its myriad of altars for wash basins, and placed vanity mirrors in front of the statue of the gods. This cultural vandalization would be just an appetizer for events in the future. 2 emissaries were sent by Emperor Xianfeng. Both were commissioners. The first was the 74-year-old Guiliang, a senior military officer. The other was a 53-year-old Mongolian military officer. They went with the Europeans at the Temple of the Oceanic Influences southwest of Tientsin, and Lord Elgin arrived on June the 4th alongside 50 Royal Marines and a band from the warship Calcutta to add some muscle. The first meeting went terribly. The commissioners had the authority to negotiate, but lacked carte blanche to finalize any deal. Go figure. Elgin stormed out of the first meeting, completely blowing off this lavish buffet the Qing had set for the party to celebrate the new peace treaty. Now, Elgin was well known to be courteous, but after spending 6 months in China, he had quickly learnt the only way to get Qing officials to act was to show some bravado. Elgin even wrote to his wife at the time, "I have made up my mind, disgusting as the part is to me, to act the role of the uncontrollably fierce barbarian." As Elgin stomped his feet, walking off, he made a threat that he would soon march upon Beijing, even though in truth the Europeans did not have the land forces to do so. Elgin left his brother to continue negotiations, Lord Frederick Bruce. One of Frederick's interpreters, Horatio Lay, decided it was a good idea to use some Sturm und Drang, and began to literally scream at the Qing commissioners whenever they talked about clauses in the new treaty. Lay even threatened to lay waste to Beijing and would slap the emperor himself. This guy had some real balls. Lei's abuse of the two commissioners became so bad, the men went around his head to speak to Tientsin and the American envoy William Reed. Reed sent a letter to Elgin asking him to help rein in the tyrannical Lei, but Elgin ignored the letter. Tientsin asked Gros, whom he knew had grown very close to Elgin, to intercede, but Gros declined, because he feared it would alienate his friendship to Elgin. The Qing then resorted to bribery. They tried to give Lei a horse, but Lei did not change his aggressive stance. The negotiations were taking very long. It was the typical Chinese strategy of procrastination. I mean, we've seen it so many times at this point. Elgin was becoming livid, and he wrote in his diary about Reed and Tientsin, "These sneaking scoundrels do whatever they can to thwart me, and then while affecting to support the Chinese act as their own worst enemies." Elgin also felt British Parliament had failed to back him up. Elgin received a letter from the new Foreign Minister, Lord Malmesbury, on April the 9th, berating him for not concluding a peace treaty in due time. "A cabinet has been held today, and it is our anxious wish to see this Chinese business settled, if it can be done without loss of honor and commercial interest at the present enjoyed. Our reputation is sufficiently vindicated at Canton, and we do not look at the chance of a war with the Chinese Empire without much apprehension. I trust, therefore, that you will not engage us in a contest of this sort, if you can possibly avoid it." Well, the negotiations over the terms of the new treaty stretched for 3 weeks, and the Qing were rejecting 2 clauses the British absolutely wanted. Those being free passage throughout China and for a permanent British and French embassy at the Qing imperial court. The 2 commissioners stated that accepting either of these would cost them their lives. Gros and Tientsin began arguing that the permanent embassy point was not critical as long as their ministers had access to Beijing in some form. After much arguing, the commissioners conceded to the 2 points, and thus the Treaty of Tientsin was formed. The Europeans made sure to add a clause that henceforth they would no longer be called barbarians in official communications and treaties. Though it should be noted, the term used by the Chinese literally just meant those who don't speak Chinese. The Treaty of Tientsin opened new ports for trade: Tientsin, Hangzhou, and Nanjing. It should be noted the Qing were all too happy to toss Nanjing into the treaty as it was currently under Taiping rule. I mean, not just rule, it was their capital. So the Qing were thinking, maybe if they were lucky, the Europeans would go over to Nanjing, run into some trouble, and attack the Taiping for them. Baron Gros raised concerns over the clauses as he argued Britain would have to bear even more military might to enforce the treaty. As Gros pointed out to Elgin, the Confucius principle, a promise made under duress, did not need to be kept. Another item of the treaty clauses was the payment of 2 million taels of silver to Britain for the damage to their factories at Canton, and another 2 million in just general reparation. The French would also receive 2 million taels as well. Now the warnings Gros had made concerned Elgin, and he was having second thoughts. One major concern was the idea of extracting the enormous sums of money from what seemed to be an empire on the verge of bankruptcy. Elgin wrote back to the foreign minister, concerned that extracting the large sums of money would lead to the toppling of the Manchu rule. Everything we saw around us indicated the penury of the treasury. To despair by putting forward pecuniary claims which could satisfy only by measures that would increase its unpopularity and extend the area of rebellion. Elgin ended by saying the humiliating treaty would be a large beacon for the Taiping rebels. William Reed recommended legalizing opium as a clause, arguing the tax revenue from it would benefit the Qing Empire. The British wanted a tariff of only 30 taels, and the Kohang merchants supported this. Jardin and Matheson and Company released a statement. "The use of opium is not a curse, but a comfort and a benefit to the hard-working Chinese people." Boy, oh boy, you don't get any more gross than that one. The French, for their part, performed a study of the opium problem in China at this time. Baron Gros found that users who smoked up to 8 pipes per day had a life expectancy of only 6 years. Casual consumers could expect around 20 years after starting to smoke it. Many were dying at around the age of 50 or so. Opium addicts were found to be spending 2/3 of their income to feed their addiction. The Russians and Americans agreed with the French that the opium trade was, simply put, horrible. The French, however, had little to nothing to say about another form of trade that they took part in quite a lot in China, the pig trade. That being the enslavement of coolies. Now, you have to hear this one. This is so symbolic of the event as a whole. The translator for the treaty took forever because he himself was an opium addict. You just can't make this stuff up, folks. The Russians agreed to the terms first on June the 18th, with Tientsin signing off, making Elgin feel betrayed and abandoned because he still had some qualms about it. What was really important to Russia was the border that they shared with the Qing Empire. It had been a source of much conflict. Thus, Russia settled with a visiting ambassador to Beijing with no permanent status. Christianity received a formal toleration, and the Russians got access to 2 more ports, on Taiwan and Hainan. 5 days later, the Americans signed off on a similar agreement to that of the Russians. Now, both the Americans and Russians made sure to include the most favored nations clause in their treaties, which meant that whatever further concessions went to the British and the French, they too would enjoy them. Thus, the 2 nations who brought literally 0 military aid and did basically nothing reaped the same benefits as the 2 nations shouldering everything. Ain't that nice? Tientsin sent Elgin and Gros a copy of Russia's treaty, urging them to not topple the Manchu rule, with too many humiliating concessions. Reed likewise made a similar appeal. Gros reached an agreement on June the 23rd and did not hesitate to sign the treaty because he did not want to undercut Elgin's negotiators, preferring to let them finish the job. The French also sought much less than Britain from the Chinese. A week after, the British still had not come to an agreement. Gros became impatient and he sent Elgin a letter that if the British did not sign, soon the French would simply sail off. The British were stuck on 2 key issues: to have a permanent ambassador in Beijing and the freedom to travel anywhere within China. The Chinese commissioners desperately sought the aid of Gros and Tientsin, indicating to them that the emperor was literally going to kill them if they agreed to the 2 clauses. Elgin threatened to march on Beijing, and it seems the commissioners were forced to give in. On June the 26th, the British Treaty of Tientsin was ratified. The Chinese would pay $5 million in war reparations. Christian missionaries would be allowed to work unhindered throughout China, and 11 ports would be opened for trade. Taxes on imported goods would be set on a follow-up meeting at Shanghai, and there was a 5% already agreed upon. Taxable goods would be silk, brocades, and of course, opium. The taxation agreement basically made opium legal in China, but without bringing the subject up. The commissioners signed the treaty, but when they got back to Beijing, take a wild guess. The emperor, of course, rejected the humiliating terms. Now, Lord Elgin failed to bring up the issue of opium, and its official legalization, as were the instructions he had received from Clarendon. Elgin probably felt since Clarendon lost his position, he no longer had to respect the order. Clarendon's successor, Lord Malmesbury, did not give a similar order. On July the 3rd, 400 men and a naval band serenaded Elgin signing the Treaty of Tientsin at the Temple of the Oceanic Influences, under some paper lanterns. And despite the fact the commissioners, as they said it, were soon to be beheaded, they invited Elgin to a lavish dinner at the temple after the signing. At the dinner, one of the commissioners, Hua Shan, gave Elgin copies of some famous poetry. The next day, Baron Gros signed the French treaty, but cheekily added some new demands that the commissioners were forced to abide by. He demanded the release of all the Chinese Christians imprisoned for their faith. Gros sent a triumphant report back home, stating this: I am happy to be able to announce today to Your Excellence that China has at last opened itself to Christianity, the real source of all civilization, and to trade and the manufactures of the nations of the West. Back in Britain, Elgin's triumph was met with mixed reviews, though most were favorable. Elgin's private secretary, Lawrence Oliphant, noted the impressive cost-to-benefit ratio of the casualties in his 1860 account of the campaign, narrative of Earl of Elgin's mission to China and Japan. Here is some of that account. Hostilities with the Empire of China had terminated with a loss to the British arms of about 20 men killed in action, and a treaty had been signed far more intensive in its scope and more subversive of imperial prejudice than that concluded 15 years before, after a bloody and expensive war which had been protracted over a period of 2 years. Karl Marx, yes, the Karl Marx, was working at the time as a European correspondent of the New York Tribune when he wrote a letter to his writing partner, Friedrich Engels, on some of the thoughts towards the conflict. The present Anglo-Chinese treaty, which, in my opinion, was worked out by Palmerston in conjunction with the Petersburg cabinet and given to Lord Elgin to take him on his journey, is a mockery from the beginning to end. Karl Marx would have a lot more to say about the Taiping Rebellion, which is quite interesting, given the rebellion is considered a proto-Marxist one. Elgin himself was quite depressed over the entire ordeal, and he would write in his diary, "I have an instinct in me which loves righteousness and hates iniquity, and all this keeps me in a perpetual boil. Though I have been forced to act almost brutally, I am China's friend in almost all this." To try and raise the celebration somewhat, Elgin decided to take 5 ships up the Yangtze River as a demonstration of Britain's naval power and to discourage the Chinese from going back on their new treaty. However, news of some raids against Canton forced him to pull back, cutting the trip short. The new viceroy of Canton, named Huang, had incited a rebellion, rallying Canton residents to, quote, "Go forth in your my raids, then, and take vengeance on the enemies of your sovereign, imbued with public spirit and fertile in expedients." In July, a group of Cantonese got their hands on some artillery, and they began to shell the British resident at Whampoa. The Cantonese mob followed this up by performing a raid after they heard about the humiliating terms of the Treaty of Tientsin. During a short conference in Shanghai, Elgin demanded Viceroy Huang be removed. On top of the Canton problem, the 2 commissioners, Gui Liang and Hua Shan, had reneged on the treaty clauses about allowing British ambassadors in Beijing. They sent a letter to Elgin stating that they had to agree to such clauses under duress and suggested the future British ambassadors visit Beijing from time to time as diplomatic business warranted. They argued that because of large-scale xenophobia in Beijing, they feared for the lives of any British dwelling there. Then 4 days later, they added another excuse. They said that to allow British ambassadors to live in Beijing would generate fear and loss of respect for the Qing government. Such further humiliation might very well topple the Manchu and allow the Taiping to take over. Elgin was somewhat swayed by the Taiping excuse, and he said he would press on their message over to the foreign officer. Elgin was also in a bit of a tough position. After all, a rebellion was occurring in Canton, and it was starting to make things a bit more clear that guaranteeing the safety of British ambassadors in Beijing may not be an easy task. The French concurred with Elgin that to have ambassadors in Beijing would be dangerous now. In the meantime, Elgin had set up a 2-month survey of the Yangtze River using 2 gunboats to demonstrate Britain's new right of travel throughout China. The idea had been to see if the local Chinese would obey the treaty clauses. Elgin's tour wound up going past the Taiping capital of Nanjing, and it is alleged a single cannon perched upon one of Nanjing's walls fired upon Elgin's ships. Elgin's reprisal was pretty brutal. He sent a volley knocking out the Taiping cannon, then ordered a 99-minute naval bombardment of Nanjing before sailing on. Elgin had planned to finish his trip by meeting with the Emperor and giving him a letter sent from Queen Victoria, but the worsening of the Canton situation forced him to pull back south. In February of 1859, Cantonese rebels ambushed and massacred 700 British Marines around the countryside of Canton. In retaliation, General von Straubensee, the military commander of 3,000 troops in Canton, hunted down the headquarters of the rebels, which they found at Xixing, a few miles south of the city, and completely annihilated all those there and razed everything to the ground. The destruction of the rebel camp seems to have worked quite well, as suddenly the emperor sent word to ratify the Treaty of Tientsin's clauses, and had Huang removed from power, demanding the rebels disband. While Elgin dealt with the renewed China problem, his brother, Frederick Bruce, returned to Britain with the signed Treaty of Tientsin. Lord Malmesbury rewarded Bruce by naming him the first ambassador to China, a post Elgin would have received, but he was too wary of this post given the circumstances now. Elgin left China in March of 1859, taking the chance to link up with his brother in Sri Lanka in April, as Bruce was on his way back to China. Now, Bruce was not as great as his brother, let's say. He had recently been the Lieutenant Governor of Newfoundland, then the Colonial Secretary of Hong Kong. In all honesty, a lot of his appointments were merely the result of him being Elgin's brother. But Bruce did have working knowledge of Chinese customs. Bruce arrived back at the mouth of the Beihua River on June 18th of 1859 alongside a force of 16 warships. Admiral Seymour had returned to London and was replaced by Rear Admiral James Hope. Unfortunately, it seems Hope was even more racist and hated the Chinese more so than Seymour. 3 days later, the new American ambassador showed up, John E. Ward, aboard a steamer, the Powhatan. The French representative, Anson du Babylon, brought 2 warships with him as the French fleet had remained close by in Indochina. Now, Emperor Xianfeng wanted above all else to keep the Europeans the hell out of Beijing. The emperor suggested right away that they should ratify the new treaty at Shanghai, but all 3 of the European powers declined this. Many of the emperor's close advisors wanted to resist the foreigners taking up residence in Beijing. Some of these high-ranking officials gave orders for 3 large bamboo booms, 3 feet thick, to be strung across the Beihua River to block the foreign advance. It looked like war was back on the menu, and in a vain attempt, Bruce tried to write a letter to Beijing, politely asking the booms to be removed. Well, Bruce got no reply, and this prompted Admiral Hope to ask permission to blow the first boom up. On June the 21st, Hope sent Captain Wills aboard a steamer to break through the first boom, which went successfully, but the other 2 proved unbreakable. The British tried using some gunpowder, but it just couldn't do the job. Then, to add insult to injury, during the night, the Qing repaired the first boom. On June the 25th, Bruce received a letter from the Viceroy of Jili Province, Hung Fu, and Hung suggested the ambassadors lodge at Beitang, around 8 miles north of Beijing. Basically, it was a face-saving gesture. The British, however, were armed to the teeth, and they had just undergone 3 annoying and long years of negotiations and war, and they didn't have any more patience. Bruce told Admiral Hope to attack the booms again. That afternoon, Hope took his flagship, Plover, and attempted ramming the boom, but this time, his ship was stopped cold. The Qing, it seems, had learned a lesson from the previous conflict, and, at this time, they made the second and third booms out of full-sized tree trunks slung together with heavy chains. As the Plover stalled, and the other European gunships were forced to stop as well, all of a sudden, the fort's portholes were cast aside to reveal a full complement of 40 cannons, and they all opened fire. The first salvo took the head right off Plover's bow gunner, and 3 other sailors fell wounded. For 3 hours, Plover was pulverized. Admiral Hope unwisely stood on his deck wearing a gold braid, basically showcasing to the Chinese he was a high-ranking official. A Qing sharpshooter landed a shot, hitting Hope in his thigh. Hope fell on the deck, and he was bound up by a surgeon as the Qing continued their retaliation. For a rather surprising change, the Qing cannons, though still immobile, were better aimed and managed to blow Hope's second-in-command and 8 other sailors to pieces, wounding another 22 men. Plover's hull eventually burst, sinking the ship into the mud, and this would lead to the deaths of countless of the crew. Hope, believe it or not, got up and rowed over to another ship, the Opossum, and began standing on its deck in plain sight. Because of his thigh wound, he had to hold onto a railing to hold himself upright, and that said railing was hit by a Qing cannonball. The railing collapsed and Hope fell, breaking several ribs. Ouch. This prompted him to turn command over to one Captain Shadwell. The Qing, meanwhile, were sending volleys, managing to disable 5 of the invaders' frontal gunships, prompting Bruce to order 7 more, which were about 8 miles away, to come forward and replace the damaged ones. By the evening, 5 British warships had been immobilized and 2 had run aground, with 1 sitting duck for fort cannons. The fort guns went silent in the early evening, and the British officers took it to mean that the fort garrisons had fled, like they had always done in the previous conflicts. Thus, landing parties surged ahead, as planned, and that's when disaster struck. It turned out to be a ruse, to entice the landing parties to storm the beach. The landing parties soon found out, to their horror, 2 trenches were dug in front of the walls, filled with water and mud, and some large iron spikes behind them. That was really bad, but to make things worse, when the Marines got off their barges, the muddy banks seized their feet, leaving them helpless as the forts unleashed carnage upon them. Those lucky enough to make it to the trenches found the muddy water was too thick to swim. Many men, in despair, clambered beside the base of the fort walls to escape the trenches and the gunfire. The Qing began setting off fireworks to illuminate the trapped Marines as they fired down upon them. Although America said it would remain neutral, Commodore Josiah Tatnall aboard the USS Powhatan was trying to get past the booms as well when he ran into the conflict. Tatnall was a veteran of the War of 1812, and like pretty much any American at this time, disliked the British immensely. Tatnall received word that Hope had been shot, and upon witnessing the horror show, he suddenly cast neutrality to the wind. Tatnall was from Georgia, a loyal Southerner with, let's say, strong senses of racial pride. Yeah, that's what we're gonna call it. Well, whatever hate Tatnall held for the British was cast aside as he suddenly screamed out this: "Blood is thicker than water. I'd be damned if I stood by and watched white men butchered before my very eyes." Tatnall charged forward, and this hardly turned the tide of battle. It actually pretty much amounted to towing more British Marines forward to their horrific deaths. When Tatnall and his men got over to the ship, they began to operate some of the British guns, firing at the fort as they did, while Tatnall personally tended to Hope. A single American died, and the breach of neutrality could have caused a catastrophe. This really was a very significant event. America signed a treaty of neutrality after all, and this was a breach of said neutrality, and the Qing would definitely notice it. Yet I guess one good thing that came about from it, you could say, was it set a new tone for British-American friendship. As the London Times wrote, "Whatever may be the result of the fight, England will never forget the day when the deeds and words of kindly Americans sustained and comforted her stricken warriors on the waters of the Beihou." So I guess that's one point towards the racist Southern American guy who just threw everything to the wind. Now around 7 p.m., as the Qing set off fireworks to illuminate the area, Captain Shadwell, with 50 Royal Marines and French seamen led by the French commander, Tricot, landed on some muddy flats outside one of the Taku Forts. They clambered through knee-deep mud as the defenders rained Gingal fire down upon them from very short range. The British Franco force found themselves literally stuck in the mud, unable to use their wall-scaling ladders to get over the fort. Shadwell sent word back to his superior that he and his men were pinned down and requested reinforcements to storm the Taku walls. There was no more fighting men available, however, and he was eventually ordered to limp back to the ships. The British and French suffered high casualties. Shadwell was wounded, Tricot was dead, and of the 1,000 men who took part in the battle, around half were killed or wounded. 29 of them were officers. Many men dragged themselves or limped through the mud to get back to their ships. A lot of these men were veterans of the Crimean War and had never tasted such defeat before. One veteran of the Battle of Balaclava said he would have rather relived that battle 3 times over than suffer the Taku Forts again. The gunboats Lee, Plover, Cormorant were all disabled, and the Kestrel sank. Admiral Hope sent a dispatch to the Admiralty, showing his shock at how the Qing performed. Had the opposition they expected been that, as usual in Chinese warfare, there is little doubt that the place would have been successfully carried at the point of the bayonet. To try and save face, Bruce reported back to Britain that the sudden military prowess of the Qing forces at the Taku Forts was because Russians were helping them. Yeah, I guess Bruce watched Rachel Maddow too much. He alleged this based on eyewitness testimony that some men had saw men in fur hats and European dress, and that they had been directing operations atop the Taku Forts. And this was mere bullshit. The real reason for the Qing victory was because of Prince Qin. Qin was a Mongol cavalry commander that had helped the Qing crush a large army of Taiping rebels. He was a member of the Beijing clan and the 26th generation descendant of Caesar, a brother to Genghis Khan. He led the Qing forces to smash the Taiping during the northern expedition in the southern suburbs of Tientsin. When the Second Opium War broke out, he was appointed imperial commissioner in charge of the defense of Tientsin. And just to ease my work a bit, I will call him Sung going forward. Sung rejoiced in his well-earned victory. He wrote back to the emperor acknowledging the British and French might return with more ships, but asserted confidently he would thrash them again and again. He added this: "The pride and vainglory of the barbarians, already under severe trial, will immediately disappear. When that happens, China can then enjoy some decades of peace. The barbarians, already somewhat disillusioned and repentant, may lend themselves to persuasion and be brought under control. If they, of their own accord, should wholeheartedly become obedient, then peace would be secure and permanent." The emperor responded with caution. "The foreigners may harbor secret designs and hide themselves around nearby islands, waiting for the arrival of more soldiers and ships for a surprise attack in the night or in a storm." Emperor Xianfeng still shared a sense of relief and expressed hope the foreigners' needs for Chinese goods would mean they could sort out their problems in Shanghai, and that there would be no need for ambassadors in Beijing, nor any new treaties. Tseng also pointed out during the battle that Americans got involved. Although the starting of hostilities was by the English barbarians, France and America's cooperation in the melee is also inescapable. Tseng based his claim off the intelligence extracted from a Canadian POW named John Powers. Yes, a Canadian was there. John claimed to be a neutral American in an attempt to escape imprisonment. The Chinese did not free him and instead used him as proof the Americans had abandoned neutrality. Tseng, much like most Chinese at the time, were weak on Western geography, and they assumed Canada was just part of the United States. My God, that makes me think back to a time when I was in Germany, and my ex-girlfriend's grandfather at the time, I think he had to be in his 90s, he was told I was a Canadian, and he also said, "Oh, is that part of the United States?" Sad Canadian noises. Anyways, at one point an American missionary who spoke Chinese tried to explain to Tseng the difference between English and French Canada, and that of the United States. So Tseng described this experience in a letter back to the Qing imperial court. "The missionary stated that America contained Englishmen and Frenchmen, and when there was fighting, the flag was the only criterion." Well, eventually John was released after a month, and the Qing simply did not want to add America to a long list of growing enemies. Couldn't blame them. I would like to take this time to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of kings and generals over at YouTube. please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast, the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all of that you are still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel over at YouTube, where I have a very long 45-minute episode on the Second Opium War, splicing in a lot of footage from the film The Opium War from 1997. Makes for a pretty good episode, I'd say. Give it a look, it would mean a lot to me. The battle for the Taku Forts was an absolute catastrophe, resulting in humiliation for the Europeans for once. Prince Ching had a grand victory. Perhaps now the foreign barbarians would learn their lesson and stop their war. Or perhaps the Europeans would lick their wounds and come right back.